Welcome to the special edition of To The Point. Today our guest is Professor Irfan Habib, a very eminent historian of modern India. Professor Habib was educated at Aligarh, and over the years since he joined Aligarh University as a faculty in 1953, he has emerged as one of the person who not only in historical profession but in our intellectual life who has changed the way we define India, we define historiography, we define our intellectual and professional commitment. Professor Habib, you grew up in Aligarh in the days when it was a height of Indian independence movement, as well as Aligarh was the center of a very passionate communal mobilization too. Now, looking back, how do you see the national movement and the coming of the freedom, coming of independence, all things together?
Well, actually my own personal reaction was influenced partly by the environment at Aligarh, undoubtedly, but also because of the fact that my parents were Congress sympathizers, and my father particularly was one of the early nationalist historians of medieval India, and they continued to maintain their opposition to the Muslim League and the demand for partition. So, I belonged in a sense to a minority within a minority, but it is important to remember that a substantial minority of Muslims was not with the Muslim League. That could be seen also from the votes in the 1946 elections, which were not only with a limited electorate, but were also not really free. Particularly Muslims trying to vote for Congress had a hard time of it, but still the Congress did get something like 15 to 20% vote, Muslim vote in many constituencies, including Aligarh. So, I was personally committed to the national movement, not because of perhaps any personal conviction, but because of the inherited conviction. Nearer independence, since I sat for high school examination in 1947, I think I began to be personally convinced also of the nationalist cause, and my sympathies were with the Congress. But at the same time, I had begun to read Marxist literature, and therefore also was turning towards the communist movement when India became free.
Independence came in 47, and the very gush of new freedom. What did you see the major changes coming, and you could sense that
Yes, there were, one could sense the change from 46. In early 1946, Congress government came into power in UP. There was a change. Land reform was in the air, for example, and my leftist sympathies were all for land reform. Then there was the provisional government, the Asian Relations Conference, where for the first time India stepped into the world arena. Today perhaps it is very difficult to realize the sense of pride that one felt when India hosted the Asian Relations Conference with delegates from Indonesia, Kuomintang, China, but especially Soviet republics, Asian republics, which signified that India could extend its hand of friendship to the Soviet Union as well. Then although there was partition, the fact that AMU was very strongly protected by the Kumaun regiment and the government took special care for the AMU also had its impact. And then of course the changes began to come. Sweepers began to get the same wages as peons for the first time. Now many things that we now take for granted came. If you take the position of Harijans or Dalits, not only would water be offered to them for the first time in the railway stations, but it would be they who would dispense the water there. And these now look to be the small changes, but shocked the upper caste people and Muslims also at that time. But after some time, everybody began to drink from the hands of Harijan dispensers. So then women began to be appointed. There was a circular, I believe, from the government that you cannot in universities refuse women appointments, and so AMU, we had a lady teacher, lecturer, Dr. Ms. Siddhant, when we were doing our BA.
Vice Chancellor?
Dr. Siddhant's daughter. So the change came in AMU as well. There was much pride that we felt when on January 26, India became a republic. I remember we had candle lights, oil lamps in our house. And this because, despite the fact that in the communist movement we felt that the independence was not real independence, but there were these things in the air which one could not ignore, and which also one felt despite one's mental reservations, so to speak.
Now it's time for a small break. Please don't go away. Keep watching RSTV. Welcome back. We are talking to Professor Irfan Habib today. How did you feel when India hosted the Asian Relations Conference?
Well, I said that we all felt very proud that India had entered, in a sense, the world arena, and that it was following a policy which was different from that of colonial Britain, with extending hands of friendship to the Soviet Union and independent Indonesia.
Do you think we still have that kind of pride being a free, independent India?
Well, one will always feel proud to be independent, but this is not at the moment one, at least I don't feel as proud of our foreign policy, because we are allowing considerations other than the welfare of peoples of the countries with which we ought to be concerned, and viewing things apparently from our own very narrow interest, which might not even be our own national interest. One sees this, in particularly when we are concerned with West Asia. I remember how in mid-1950s we supported Egypt, we condemned the invasion by Israel, we condemned the occupation of Suez by England and France. But recently, if we compare our positions with similar events in West Asia and North Africa, that independence is not there. Even on Syria we voted, where even South Africa and Pakistan kept neutral. We voted for the West resolution, which was against all the principles of the United Nations Charter, which India had up till now been upholding. So surely this is a period for self-examination.
Mr. Habib, you have talked about in your magnum opus, agrarian system of Mughal Empire, but the way state was exploitative system. And you talked in 1963, that very, very classic paper, Possibilities of Capitalist Development in India, how British exploitative system worked in India. Do you think the new economy that that was ushered in 1940s and 50s, broke those chain of exploitation, and we live in
Yes,
new
for
time.
that we should understand that we had ourselves developed a whole branch of discipline which used to be called Indian economics, which is no longer taught in our universities. Even under British, where our syllabus was prepared, we had in BA a paper called Indian economics, which was really the nationalist critique of British exploitation of India. I still have books like P. Banerjee on Indian economics. Now, with that background, the new national government, independent Indian government, tried to shape Indian economy differently. There was already the Fundamental Rights Resolution of 1931, the Karachi Resolution, according to which this policy was shaped. So, this is wrong to say that something was enforced in India which was new and which was not promised in the earlier nationalist pronouncements. It was seen that we could only develop our economy if we had a heavy industry sector, machine building sector, and this could only be done through public investment, public sector, because India there was not enough local capital, and that is why India went in for planning, public sector development, and a certain amount of protection. That yielded results not only in the industrial development, but also in the realm of food supply. I have seen data which show that Indians per capita had more to eat in 1971 and 1981 when compared to what they have today, and that's a very great certificate for the kind of economic development we practiced. Of course, like anything in the world, it had faults, but they could have been rectified without abandoning the entire system. Today, owing to popular opinion, the whole system has not been disbanded, but it has been very greatly weakened. And as one can see, privatization has had the result of destroying a large small industry sector, in which, for example, Aligarh city is a witness. Large factories with thousands of workers have been closed down for the last 15 or 18 years, ever since liberalization came. So, the balance sheet of liberalization is not as one-sided as is indicated by industrial figures of economic growth, because the growth is more in the service sector than in the industrial sector, which is I think would be a weak point for any economy. The basic
Coming back to what you were talking about, the service sector, where Indian universities and the education system had played a very great role since 1950s, and that is also the result of a large intellectual segment that had come up during the national movement. How do you see the Indian intelligentsia universities contributing to the large development over the last 60 years?
Well, I am afraid you will say that old people always condemn the young. So, one likes one's own generation, and one likes the generation of people like V.K.R.V. Rao and Kausambi and others. At least I feel that they had a vision which Friedman's followers lack. And certainly, when one reads even today Nehru's autobiography and glimpses of world history, one sees a vision which is totally lacked among Indian politicians today. The boldness is not there, the breadth of vision is not there. And one has to think why, And one has also to think why we should accept, as we did not accept before 1947, why we should accept the economic theory as is served to us by the major institutions of the West, the business schools and so forth. We would not have fought for our independence if we had believed what was being taught in Western universities before 47.
We'll come back to the boldness that you're talking about after the break. We'll have a small break. Please don't go away. Keep watching Honesty. Welcome back. We are talking to Professor Habib. We just talked about boldness of the political leadership. But you are epitome of boldness that historians in India have depicted over the years. And that's why Indian historiography is one of the strongest historiography in the world over. Now, you have talked about from 1950s onwards about the Muslim communal historiography and attacked them. You talked about in 80s and 90s about Hindu communal historiography, and in fact you led the whole movement against that kind of historiography, which actually is not very scientific. How do you see the contours of these two communalism in the last 60 odd years?
Well, I mean, any country that has different religious communities has traditions of integration and also problems of adjustment. And one recognizes that this is the case with India as well. But there are other issues apart from adjustments of communal interests or community interests, which also must shape one's policies. There is, for example, the fact that before 1947, anyone who talked about only Hindu nationalism or anyone who talked about Muslims as a nation objectively aided British imperialism. Whatever be their personal views, this kind of divisive ideology, whatever pretensions it might have about also being against British rule, in fact, supported the interests of British rule. And therefore, we must recognize that if India is to remain a nation and develop as a nation, for which there are thousands of reasons, particularly the people's own well-being is best served if India remains a nation, then interests of communities must be properly adjusted. This means affirmative action, but not necessarily a policy of mindless concessions. Our difficulty, as I see it, is that the perception of secularism that the Supreme Court has accepted and that our politicians propound is a peculiarly local view of secularism, which will be found in the Hindi translation Dharm Nirpekshata, which is not a translation of secularism, but is only another way of saying religious tolerance. This was promoted by Radhakrishnan in his book Recovery of Faith, and for reason unknown, the Supreme Court has accepted this definition of secularism. I believe that we should go to secularism as it is understood throughout the world, separation of religion from the state. And we should properly implement the constitutional provisions prohibiting religious instruction. Even where minority institutions are permitted by our constitution, and they are perhaps legitimate in any secular state, religious instruction is another matter that should not be permitted. Minority institutions should not mean that they are religious institutions or institutions with any religious orientation. They only serve a linguistic or religious minority, but they must give only secular education. Now, therefore, the BJP position of providing instruction in religion, which was upheld by the Supreme Court in a remarkably illogical judgment, is totally wrong and cannot be upheld under any concept of secularism. Similarly, the present position, particularly recommended by Sachar committee of supporting madrasas, is totally wrong, because this will lead to separation of Hindu and Muslim school boys and school girls, which will be unfortunate. And again, this strikes at the very constitutional provision of not allowing religious instruction to be given in maintained institutions, and in aided institutions it can't be made compulsory. It is in fact compulsory in all madrasas. So, Muslims have a right, as all other communities, to a proper secular education, and there should not be, as far as possible, separate education, because separate education can never be equal. This is at least one decision of the US Supreme Court, which we should wholeheartedly agree to. As far as communal ideologies are concerned, certainly the fall of the Soviet Union and the receding of the socialist ideal, although our preamble says that we should be a socialist society, I haven't heard the Prime Minister talking about socialism in all the period he has been in the chair. So, the receding of the socialist ideology has opened the gates to communal ideologies, but these must be fought. There is no way in which these can be allowed to prevail, and therefore, and this is the task not only of government but of, I think, all educated people, all those who think that India has to implement modern values, give women their full rights, have affirmative action to pull up the backward classes and communities. All should join in the effort to oppose both Hindu and Muslim communal ideologies.
I'm so glad you actually talked about very critical issues that India as a nation is facing. Also, we as an intellectual community in the country are facing today, and how best to face them in the right perspective. You have just indicated some of the bullet points for us. Thank you very much, Professor Habib, for this very nice and elaborate interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is all we have with us today. See you next week. Till then, goodbye.